Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called life. In the deal of word, life brings forever. That's a mighty long time, but I'm here to tell you.
You've joined the Betamax Video Club, rewinding back to our favourite films of the 1980s. My name's Rich Nelson. Tonight I've rented Purple Rain. Watching it with me is Catherine Lowe. Hello, Catherine. How are you?
I'm ready to purify myself in Lake Minnetonka.
Now, this is a film that I think means a lot to a lot of people, but to yourself, what is so special about Prince for you?
Well, I once queued for 8 hours to get into a Prince gig, and I would have happily done it for twice as long, so that probably tells you all you need to know.
There's some strong credentials there. Which gig was it?
It was his hit and run Coco gig in 2014 in Camden in February.
Wow, okay. It must have been good.
It was very good, yes.
And how many times have you seen Prince?
I saw him 4 times. I was very lucky to see him 4 times.
Oh wow, okay. And let's say we're talking about Purple Rain. Now this is a film that you, from our chats before, adore clearly. And I'll put this out. I've never seen it before 2 days ago. Ah, what a film! Thank you very much. What is so special about Purple Rain for you?
Well, I bought the Purple Rain soundtrack sometime in the mid-90s from the record shop in Bangor, which was the city near to where I was living. And this record shop was called Cobb. It's now closed, sadly. And I got the soundtrack on cassette, and I got to know it very well over the years. The beautiful ones in particular got me through some points of melodrama in my personal life, let's say. It's a really incredible album, and it never gets old, not just because it's really inventive musically, but it's also like got a narrative of its own that pulls you in. And I didn't see the film until quite a few years later, and the performance scenes in particular in the film just really knocked me sideways. I don't think I've ever watched the film. I've seen it quite a few times since, and I don't think I've ever watched it without feeling quite moved by those scenes. They're really something else. I don't know what you thought, though, seeing it for the first time.
It was again strange. You know, you watch a film with. It's hard to have these sort of even preconceptions about it. I mean, I was never a huge Prince fan growing up. I don't. It just kind of. I've talked about this before about films and books and all sorts. It kind of I missed the train a little bit with that one, but I liked his music, and coming to it, it's hard to know exactly where it's going to be. Where a film is so linked to its star. I mean, it is a vehicle. Let's not beat around the bush. But coming to it, it's within. There's a series of small gigs that he plays at this club in Minnesota, where it was in Minneapolis, sorry, and he's the performance he gives. I mean, if you're not a Prince fan at the beginning, I mean, it's hard to see how you wouldn't be at the end. If you are a Prince fan at the beginning, bloody hell, what's it going to turn you into at the end of it? And even if you're not a huge Prince fan and you're a human being with ears, you've probably heard at least a couple of the songs playing on radio or on TV. And when it opens with Let's Go Crazy, which is one of his more popular ones, that immediately hooks you in.
Yeah.
From the beginning. I mean, that's if there's no build up to it, that goes straight in. I mean, it really hooks you in a way that, I mean, we talked about it when we discussed Wayne's World, and I know this isn't the thing that we both wrote down, but how Wayne's World was filmed and directed by a woman who'd done a lot of work with live music, so she knew how to present it on screen.
Yeah.
And I think in this case again, the elements of it are so good that the fact that the live music scenes in it are brilliant, the rest of it, I'm not going to lie, can often pass for unintentional comedy,
Yeah.
but in a good way. I enjoy it. But but starting and ending and having bits in between of live music, it knows what its strength is, and it pretty much starts at full pelt, which I think in a film like this, it certainly takes you along for a ride.
It really does, doesn't it? I think the director Albert Magnoli, he insisted on having like more than 900 extras for those gig scenes because he really wanted to get like a proper atmosphere of people having a great time in those sequences, and got them all kind of dressed, you know, properly and everything. And the whole film starts with those stills of faces in the crowd interspersed with Prince's performance. And I think that that really kind of adds to it from the word go. It's not just about Prince and his band, it's also about the people that are making up like the crowds in that music scene in Minneapolis, and you know, the moment in time that you're in, and the fact that all of these people are people that Prince and his band and the time and all of the people playing at this venue, they're going to have to impress these guys, you know. And so it sort of gives you the perspective of someone in the crowd right from the get go, doesn't it?
Yeah, and when you see those people in the crowd, it is almost like a time capsule. You know, the film came out in 1984. It's a time capsule of that era. The looks of the people in the crowd, the people working, the doorman at the club, everything about it. And when you see that they are like judges on a talent show. They make or break an act.
Yeah.
Um, their faces portray a kind of I'm here to be entertained, like you said. You know that they're the kind of key to this. And I know a lot of films, most films will take you on a journey, and how the main character has to kind of evolve over the course of however many minutes the film is. And you see that this film takes you along with Prince, or the kid as his character in this, as he grows along the journey. I mean, this could be any film we're talking about here, but he evolves throughout the film to the point where, I mean, I might as well jump around here because if you
Oh
haven't
yeah,
seen the
yeah,
film, go,
definitely.
because you think like that throughout the film he is portrayed as kind of he's not winning the crowd, and this makes it sound like he's Gladiator or something, but he's not. You know, the crowd aren't overly into him. The management at the club are worried that, you know, he's playing these songs for himself, and he has to learn to win over the crowd. He has to play the music and do what is for other people and not just for himself, and that's kind of his chrysalis butterfly emerging moment at the end of the film.
Yeah,
And watching it and his story and his journey, and knowing that this is quite autobiographical, you feel like you learn a lot about Prince just from watching this film.
completely, completely. And I think we put certain artists on pedestals, and with someone like Prince, it's, you know, it's easy to see why he's an absolute genius. But we kind of forget that before they hit the big time, they had to really graft, and they had to sort of, you know, struggle to get recognized like anyone else. I mean, that's the thing. Even though Prince was always exceptionally gifted, it wasn't always the surefire thing that he was going to become the person that he became. And just a couple of years before this film came out, his band had been touring, and they'd played, you know, Paris, and they played London, and the act had been going down quite well. And then they got this incredible offer to support the Rolling Stones in LA. And, you know, and Prince came on wearing his trench coat and boots and underwear as outerwear, and you know, and he has this band behind him, and it's sort of a mix of genders and a mix of people from different racial backgrounds. And there was something about the whole act that made the Rolling Stones fans just really, really take against them, because it just, there was something about the combination of different factors that they hadn't really encountered before, and they got bottled off the stage. And I think it really, really shook them up. And it's just quite incredible to kind of like imagine that kind of thing happening so soon to a film like this coming out, because it just looks like someone who's already at the height of their fame, and they're just filled with confidence, and they've always been this confident. But it really wasn't the case. And apparently, when they were touring, he'd get the band, he'd film each gig, he'd get someone to film each gig, and then at the end of each gig, he'd get the band to watch the gig back. And if anyone screwed up, he'd pull them up on it. You know, it's like a really tight regime of getting everyone absolutely sort of drilled in a way they'd never been before in terms of how to nail a live performance. So what you see in the film, is that even though obviously you've got the incredible cinematography, because that's Donald Thorin, who did Officer and a Gentleman and Midnight Runs, he's, obviously really gifted and stuff. But you also are just capturing something that Prince had really like honed down to a kind of, a real art by then. So
One thing that sort of comes to mind is when watching this film, and I think recently you recommended a podcast talking about coming to America, and they were talking about how there were a number of black artists in America in the 80s that had this kind of, that either were at the peak or yet to peak in their sort of powers and fame and that. And you think about Prince in this 1984, and another link that you sent me was at the premiere of the film, Eddie Murphy was there, and this was Eddie Murphy in 1984,
yeah.
talking about being a Prince groupie. I mean, that's how big and how big a star Prince was, and how that comes across in the film. And it's hard to gauge sometimes looking back at, you look at a certain era of time and you wonder who are the big stars at the time. And I think that podcast talked about how it was an age of stardom and celebrity that perhaps we're kind of moved away from slightly now in 2021. But when you look at people, and I think the names they mentioned were Eddie Murphy, Prince, Michael Jordan, Whitney Houston, people like that. And looking at him now, he just oozes, even at the beginning when he's not quite made it and he's still supposedly quite small and not being or not winning over the crowd. The opening scenes is kind of mini montage of him in the mirror, his band warming up, everything about him getting ready to go onto the stage, and in the act it shows just everything about him is just a showman and a star, even if his sort of other personas or private life weren't quite like that. When he goes on stage, he becomes, tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be Prince.
Yes, exactly. I think that's one of the film's real strengths, is actually in a really similar way to Saturday Night Fever. It shows the contrast between what happens when he goes to the club with what's happening at home, and there's something about the real sort of stark difference between the two things that really pulls you up short, because you start with him playing Let's Go Crazy, and it just seems, this this man's on top of the world, and then he goes home to his folks' house, and it's such a dark scene that's playing out, and I think that's quite, I mean, what your point about celebrity as well is really good. And I think that's the thing about this film that's quite striking. I don't know what you thought, but nowadays when someone is incredibly famous, it feels as if their image is really tightly managed, and you're kind of encouraged to think of them as someone incredibly virtuous who does good things for the world. And this film nowadays, particularly, I think seems really daring, because it's Prince voluntarily putting himself at the center of a film that shows him to be an incredibly flawed individual. Like, he's not selling himself as some kind of paragon of virtue. He's an abuser. He's really, really jealous. He's competitive with members of his band. He's difficult to work with. There are all of these aspects of this person's character. And this time when I was watching, I was thinking the idea of an artist like that, sort of encouraging their audience to sort of think of themselves as someone with that many kind of problems, is sort of unthinkable now, isn't it?
Well, definitely, and that was one of the themes running throughout the film about, again, this leans heavily on his own personal life, but the portrayal of domestic violence in the film is quite stark. And again, as you touched on, the way that celebrities or stars now are, they wouldn't feature, or it would be very unlikely that they would feature heavily those kind of scenes, or if they did, they'd be portrayed in a certain light. And the way that the kid's dad slaps his mum, slaps him, there's so much aggression and violent, like physical violence in the house,
Yeah.
that in a movie that you kind of, I wasn't expecting it at all. because I was expecting it to be an hour and 45 minutes of purple fluff,
Yeah,
to be honest,
yeah.
and coming in and seeing, a lot of physical violence there, and it's not glamorized at all.
No, no.
Quite the opposite, but it shows how damaging it can be. But as you say, it is daring enough that they lay it on quite thick. I mean, it's repeated several times throughout, to the point where, as you said, even Prince at one point slaps his girlfriend
Yeah,
because of his jealousy. He can't deal with the fact that she's going off joining his rival's group. And that's something that is one of those scenes that, and I remember watching Wolf of Wall Street in the cinema, and it was this quite funny story about the guy who makes lots of money and he's a bit of a prick and everything else. And all of a sudden, when DiCaprio slaps his wife in the film, the whole cinema, you could feel it shake. And
yeah.
this was a film, relatively recently, but seeing that in 1984, if you're a Prince fan going to see that on a Friday night thinking, oh, this is going to be great, and all of a sudden you get that, I mean, that must be very strange. I mean, you watching that, I mean, do you think that give you any more context as to Prince's upbringing or his background?
Well, I mean, it's not meant to be an exact retelling of Prince's story. I think that it's commonly known that there are overlaps there. Like I know that his father was a musician and a real disciplinarian. So I think it's always dangerous when you know that there are overlaps to unless you know for sure, to kind of project the exact detail onto someone. But I mean, if you're a fan, that's the thing. If you're a fan of someone like Prince and you find out a little bit about him, just as with people in real life, you find out good things and bad things, because celebrities are human people, and very few people. If someone's got
Really?
yeah, well, if some I don't well, that's the thing. I don't think people think that they are anymore. Really, I think that
Mm.
people have a real sort of thing about putting celebrity in a kind of hierarchical thing where we're kind of made to think that people are, you know I don't know, like anyone that's got a squeaky clean image, that'll probably just be because you haven't necessarily been, you won't have had to be in a living with them, or kind of do something where you kind of see, the darker aspects of their character. I mean, obviously everyone's on a, there are different degrees, but with someone like Prince, people who are incredibly gifted, and they can be a perfectionist in one respect, and they can kind of have personal problems in one way, and then kind of in other ways that they can be exceptionally great to be around, and it's all sort of
Mm.
these different myriad of different things. So.
What?
I'm gonna join Morris's group.
One of the reasons that initially we had talked about doing this episode now was that we're coming up to 5 years since Prince passed away. And I mean, I guess you said yourself you were quite fortunate that not long after he died, there was a screening of this that you went to see. And I mean, I watched the film on my TV at home with the dog and got carried away a little bit, really got really into it. And I mean, what was the atmosphere like at the screening you went to? I mean, just if you can describe it.
Well, that does sound like a very good atmosphere, if you ask me. Well, yeah, it was a week after he'd passed away, and it was at Genesis Cinema in Bethnal Green in London, and it's quite a big theatre there, and it was completely sold out. And yeah, it was just this. I've never quite experienced it before. I went with my friend Chris, and we were just so struck by this sort of outpouring of love from all of these Prince fans. There was lots of audience participation, lots of people quoting it, sort of getting up and dancing during the gig scenes, sort of people shouting, "We love you, Prince," things like that. It was really actually quite touching. The atmosphere was, you could just feel people sort of appreciating the fact that Prince was a real one-off, and to lose someone like that at such a young age is a really sad thing.
Not even being a particular fan of his, when you heard the news, it was kind of shocking. He was so young, and it's when anyone passes, when there's someone, even Prince or Michael Jackson or that kind of thing, where they've been that big in people's lives, and that happens, and all of a sudden it's, in some cases, you reevaluate who they were, or you might take a deeper appreciation of what they did, and how they influenced millions of people. And I guess if emotions were high a week after he died, and people had the opportunity to go and see that would have been quite special. And to be honest, I mean, we talked about it, and hopefully if there is another screening of it at some point in the future, that'll definitely be an essential one on my bucket list.
Oh yeah, completely. I think it really helps it sort of come to life, and then you kind of feel like one of those people in the crowd at one of those live performances.
Now, one thing I wanted to touch on, and it's one of the things that, and I guess earlier I called it kind of unintentional comedy, but one of the other characters that we meet early on in the film is Apollonia. We call her the love interest of the film, but the female lead. And throughout, she tries to get a job at the club. She sneaks in. She's very, I suppose, improvising how she gets in here, and eventually we find out that her and Prince form a bond. They have this scene where she rides on his motorbike, and it's a sort of small montage to "Take Me With You" while he's on this motorbike. And again, I mustn't glaze over the whole motorbike issue. I mean, he rides a purple Honda. Is it Honda? I think. And
Oh, I don't
it's got
know. Yeah,
it's got the symbol, that famous, or a version of his famous symbol on the front. This
yeah.
shows how far in advance that was going.
He was apparently really into the film Quadrophenia, which I found out, which I think is so amazing because there's something about the idea of Phil Daniels on his bike in that film that's sort of quite different to Prince, quite contrast. Two very charismatic men, but in two very different ways.
Mm.
And there's something about this idea of Prince watching Quadrophenia repeatedly, and then kind of that inspiring him for that. That's really a fun thing to think about.
I suppose that's the thing. You kind of you never really know where these artists' influences come from.
Yeah,
And you think a film like Quadrophenia, you wonder how well traveled it might be, but obviously it's got its way into so much popular culture in all over the world in various guises. But to think that it may have had an influence on this scene where uh, the kid takes Apollonia up to the lake, and I mean, let's not kid around. I mean, she's a beautiful woman, and he gets her to purify herself in the lake.
Will you help me?
Nope.
Pardon me?
Nope. Wanna know why?
Nope.
Because you wouldn't pass the initiation.
What initiation?
Well, for starters, you have to purify yourself in the waters of Lake Minnetonka.
What?
You have to purify yourself in Lake Minnetonka.
I mean, it's was that their first date or their second date? Um,
there's it's such an amazing scene for so many reasons. There's something about the two of them being put in the countryside setting, which in itself really makes me laugh. But I think it's so joyous. It's fantastic. Uh, like imagine if you just sort of were having a nice day out and you kind of went around the corner of a country road and those two zoomed past you. It'd be amazing. And the fact that he bumps into Apollonia and he's sort of like looking in, the two of them are looking in some shop windows, and the clothes that Apollonia sort of hangs out in when she's just hanging around the city is this sort of like black rubber two-piece is also sort of incredible. And then the fact that he says you have to purify yourself in Lake Minnetonka, and she sort of says what in a really great way, in a way that sort of like is sort of would mimic the entire audience's reaction at that bit, and then she actually does get in, and then there's something about her trying to struggle back into that sort of black rubber two-piece after having been in the lake, as I've swam in the Hampstead ponds. I know how difficult that would be. I sort of watch her struggling, trying to put the trousers back on, thinking, oh God, she's going to be there all day. It's going to be like, she'll be covered in gunk from the lake. It's just, oh, that's not going to be fun. So
She didn't have a towel either, did she?
she didn't have a towel. I mean, the film could be called Poor Apollonia. Like, Apollonia has such a hard time. And like the film starts with her literally trying to get her foot in the door of the club, and sort of being shown into this apartment that's bad, and her saying, I don't have a phone, and the whole film is her just sort of saying to people like, I'm a singer, I'd quite like to get a job, will you help me? And people going, no, we're not going to help you. Or then if someone does help her, they kind of go, okay, we'll help you, but we're going to make you sing the most ridiculous song that anyone's ever sung in your underwear. And she just gets like, she just has a really tough time. And then at the end of the film, I always expect that Prince is going to invite her up on stage, so that she can like sing a song that isn't ridiculous, maybe not in her underwear. And then it doesn't happen. So I'm always indignant on her behalf.
She does suffer a lot, doesn't she? I mean, that like the way you described, they go up to this lake. They're both in. How can I put it politely? They're not dressed appropriately. Normally when you see a character walking, I think when they get off the bike and they're by the lake, there's rocks and pebbles. It's like being at Brighton Beach. And normally you think about, oh my God, how is she walking in those shoes? I was more worried about how he's walking in those shoes. I mean, he had some decent heels on.
Oh yeah.
That whole scene, and he's very, I suppose, on one hand, playful with her. By the time she's managed to struggle out of this freezing cold lake, managing to get her clothes back on and drying miraculously.
Yeah, I love it
He's
when she says to him, I must have looked pretty ridiculous. And he says, no, you look great. I really like that. It was very funny.
and the way he's kind of like, on the bike riding off a little bit, those kind of playful bits that I suppose in her case, I mean, she must clearly have been drawn to him because well, she got back on the bike with a big smile, even when he said to her, "Don't get my seat all wet."
which is such. There are a few lines in this film that are really Spinal Tap, because there is that line in the main song in Spinal Tap where they say like, "Not a dry seat in the house," and I think the films came out within a few months of each other. It's like, there must have been something about this moment in the 80s where people were really good at kind of nailing all the kind of comic aspects of rock and roll. Really fun.
Oh, golden age.
Golden age. I mean, Sex Shooter is a Spinal Tap song, isn't it?
I mean, that whole sequence where she goes off, and again we talked about the time the other act, or one of the other acts at the club, and Morris and Jerome, not Robson and Jerome, this act that he puts together with Apollonia as the star. I mean, it's almost like, I mean, it would be crude to just label it as a kind of prototype Pussycat Dolls, but it is a very much a prototype Pussycat Dolls. The look and the sound, it's I don't know, could you say ahead of its time or just pure exploitation?
That's the thing, and it would work in the context of the narrative if at the end Apollonia was allowed to sort of do something not quite like that, because you get that Morris is kind of that kind of guy where he's just trying to put together this girl group to try and knock the Kid and his band off the set list, so they are kind of doing it for exploitive and the scene in the rehearsal room with him telling the girls, I want to see some asses wiggling and things, it's very sort of comic book villain utopia, and they're looking really pissed off. And it's so funny, I took a date to see this film quite like within the last couple of years, and it was a very early date, and I always sort of forget. I forget bits of it. Like I'll remember all the kind of live scenes and stuff so well. And we were sort of sitting in the cinema and we got to the bit, this sex shoot of it. And I can remember kind of thinking, what must he be like? This exceptionally well brought up man. What must he be thinking? It's just got these. It's such a for such a kind of big hit film. It's got so many aspects of sort of strangeness, but I think all of those bits aren't meant to be funny. To be fair, I think like Morris
Yeah.
Day as a villain in it, I think is really good. He's kind of like someone out of Bugsy Malone or something. He's got that sort of really exaggerated, like sort of wickedness, and his band at the time, they were a real band. They were touring with Prince and the Revolution. There was a real rivalry between them as well, I think, and that really comes through. It's great.
I found Morris to be brilliant, and I always love in a film where there is a villain. And again, we call him villain. I mean, some of the films we do for the podcast, the villains are megalomaniacs or serial killers or something like that. I mean, this is a guy who just wants his rival off the bill of a nightclub, and if he can take his girlfriend as well, happy days. But I always love a double act where you've got the main bad guy and his, I've written comedy lickspittle, but
Oh yeah.
very much his Smithers, his whatever, and the interaction between them. There's such a strange fondness, and it's really well done. Even though it is deliberately played for laughs at times, but the way that Morris interacts with Jerome, the way that he interacts with Prince as well. There's this kind of, I'm not evil. You should be rooting against me, but you find me quite funny. I mean, the scene where he takes Apollonia to the club, just the chat up lines he
I
uses,
have a brass waterbed.
and apparently these were lyrics from one of their songs, I believe. But I mean, and the one I've written down, which I find just brilliant. Your lips would make a lollipop too happy.
Oh.
I mean, that is gold. That,
It
I don't
really.
know if it'd ever work, but the whole idea of this guy being this cheesy, and even those little things he does, where he buys the bottle of champagne, says keep the change, and then go and get my change back.
Yeah.
I mean, just little things like that. I mean, he's such a as a comic character, he's actually well written, which I wasn't expecting from the film. I mean, again, not knowing much about it other than it's a Prince film, you're not expecting a villain. You're not expecting, if you are, they're going to be done up in a weird way, like I don't know, in Moonwalker or something. I mean, I suppose
Yeah.
those two films are always going to kind of be compared to one another. But I thought Morris and his antics throughout were just really, really funny. I hope that
Yeah,
was the intention.
he's really really good, and I think that it's quite a good example of how if you sort of embed something in like a real life situation that's going on, even if it means you're going to use people that aren't really experienced actors or anything like that, it can really come off if you give these people an opportunity to shine. Like it's really he's got a presence that's really different from Prince's, and so there's something about the fact that they're competing with each other is really convincing, and you can sort of see how the two different bands have quite a different style, and so people could kind of take a liking to one, or they could take a liking to another.
And this inspiring jealousy, and obviously that's part of it. He's taken Apollonia out to this club that he's trying to show her off with this expensive champagne. Prince is on stage, and this becomes this kind of huge performance. I don't know whether it's driven him doing the beautiful ones on stage, where he's like intensely staring at her throughout the song,
Mm.
and not being a performer you know, in the way that Prince is. I mean, I'm not even going to talk about how many downloads the podcast gets, but it's one of those things where I suppose if you're if you're of a mind where that kind of inspires you to do that sort of thing, it's also proving Morris right, because this performance shows both the wonderful performer side of Prince, but also the ego that they talk about, that he's doing it all for himself. It's all about him and how he can't truly belong on the stage. I mean, the song's great. His portrayal in that scene, it just shows like there's so much passion there.
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, it's hard for me sitting here in a shorts and hoodie next to Labrador to convey that. I'll have to put a clip. I'll have to put a clip in. But I mean, watching that in a full cinema date or otherwise, I mean, that must have been a goosebump moment.
Oh, completely. It's one of my favorite songs of all time, I have to say. It's very special to me. And I think the reason though is sort of rooted in what you just said, in that if you're a Prince fan and you discover that song while you're still, a teenager, and when you're young, I say that as if I haven't kind of turned to it since then. Of course I have, but those incredibly self-indulgent moments that you have if you're really crazy about someone, it's just one of those songs that really gets to the core of that. But you're right, it is self-indulgent. It's like, everything's about me. You need to give me attention. I want to know that, I've got you. It's all of those things sort of encapsulated really well in a song. It's one of those songs that very few people can pull off, I think. I sent you the link to Beyonce doing it at Glastonbury, and I think she's sort of one of the only people where she could sort of like capture that incredibly sort of overblown feeling to that song and it not sort of come off as being a bit ridiculous. They're possibly the only two people, within the last sort of 30 years or so that could have done that in that way.
Go on, make everyone jealous. Say who was at that who saw that performance.
No, I'm not going. I'm not going to talk about that. No, I was. If you watch the footage as she goes into that song, you do hear some people screaming, and one of those people is me. But it's because that's the way people relate to Prince's music, though. It is strange. You can build up very personal relationships to Prince songs. So if you're in a gig setting and someone starts singing a particular Prince song that you've got a particular relationship with, it is a little bit like they've sort of said your name into the microphone or something. It feels a bit like that. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it does sound ridiculous.
No, because that was. Do you say that was 2011? No.
Yes.
I think that summer I went to the Isle of Wight Festival and Pulp were there.
Well, that's really good too.
Yeah, I don't think they covered a Prince song, but I did feel like Jarvis was talking directly at me.
Did Pulp have a song that you relate to in that way?
Weirdly common people, because I always used to do it at karaoke when I was younger, and I think I kind of joked about it before, but when I was at school, I was always kind of reminded of. I went to quite a posh school, and I'm definitely not posh, and I wasn't posh, and I was very much the token Islington boy before Islington was posh, and weirdly, it was the same school that Spandau Ballet went to, but it was. I was often reminded, mainly by the teachers, actually, not so much my colleagues or fellow pupils, that that I was reminded of my place in the world. And if you're not listening, if you're from outside the UK, this is life. This is how things are. And and I always ended up doing Common People because it was somewhat ironic, and it ended up being the place where we used to go. I think when we were 16 or 17, it was kind of our school, because it's a posh school. They had an old boys sports club that legally we could be 16 and drink in there as long as we were members, and we'd all get absolutely wankered on 4 pints of watered down Carlsberg and get up and sing something at the end. And Common People was that one for me. But maybe if I'd been a Prince fan earlier, it might have been, oh god, I'd have absolutely murdered that song.
I'm sure that's not true at all. I'm sure it's not true. I mean, these things can be just to do with how you're feeling at the time as well. I think when I was at that Beyonce performance, I think I was sort of very much in the throes of quite an intense relationship. So it also sort of hits you in that way. And, just as How about Something Changed by Pulp? How about that? That must have hit you in a particular way at a particular time. That's a
That's a
lovely romantic song.
lovely song, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, should have sang that. But we must say the song worked because as as he's singing away, he leaves in this emotional state back to his motorbike, and she's there waiting by the fire escape. And what was it he says to her? "I want to show you something," which not suggestive at all.
No, not suggestive at all. And then
But
and then he's got the thing of the tape playing the woman crying backwards, which I
yeah,
which I think if I went back to a guy's house and he played that to me, I'd probably try and leave.
well, this is the weird thing. I mean, I didn't really understand the layout of the house. I thought this was like some sort of sex shed that he had installed, away from his parents' house in the
Yeah,
garden.
yeah,
It turned out it was more like the cellar or
yeah.
basement or
I think
something.
it is. I think it is the the basement.
Yeah.
But
And
then they
it's
do go to a state. There is a shot of them making love in a stable later, isn't there? During the montage.
yeah,
Yeah. So,
that was weird, wasn't it? Um,
yeah, I
I
have
mean,
a feeling that was a scene that might have been cut down because you just see a
okay,
few moment. But I'm not sure. But I think maybe it might have been. But
yeah,
it adds to sort of it's another one of those moments in the film that sort of that make you kind of stop short and yeah, never like the whole film. You've got to say that it's quite sort of unpredictable. It kind of keeps you on your toes.
yeah. Well, definitely, because I mean that scene where they end up, and how can I put this without going red faced? Where they get down,
Yeah,
and it's I mean, I don't know. It's actually, I won't say it's graphic, but it's certainly suggestive. And I don't know if you're a young kid who's into Prince and you've already got past the domestic violence and the lines about your lips would make a lollipop too happy, and then you get to and you still make it this far, you've done well. But it was surprisingly raunchy for what it was. Although I guess with Prince's reputation, he probably expected.
yes, Prince could be pretty raunchy, couldn't he? I mean, like I remember when I was still a kid, one of the first Prince songs I properly listened to was "Get Off." I
Hmm.
don't know whether you remember that one. But it's
Yeah,
extremely it was a big hit. It was extremely raunchy, and there was something about it that made you knew that it was like this is when you're at an age where you're not quite sure sort of what sex is yet. You're sort of interested to find out, but a song like that sort of makes you feel terrified because it sort of sounds like you're going to be thrown into a lion enclosure. But it's a great record. But he's
hmm,
yeah, he could be pretty. I mean, that was sort of one of his selling points. He was very provocative.
very much. And this scene very much was. I mean, it's I one of the IMDb trivia things I read said that they filmed three different versions of it to match three different uh, certifications for the to get a rating in America, and they went for the strongest one in the end. Which I suppose you got to keep it quite realistic, I suppose. But,
Yeah.
yeah.
Apparently, the soundtrack. I heard that the inclusion of "Darling Nikki" on the soundtrack is what led to parental advisory stickers on albums.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I guess I've always, I've got Spotify and I've listened to Prince on various things over the years, and I think because I was deliberately listening to the album in preparation for this, I mean, I must say this was the first time I'd really taken notice of Darling Nikki and her ways. To put it politely, go and Google the lyrics if you want or listen to the song. But I was disappointed she wasn't a character in the film. But,
yeah, yeah. I'm sorry about that.
yeah, I'll blame you for that.
What did you say? What hotel did you think she might have been waiting at?
Well, I thought, Prince and Purple, I thought it would have been a Premier Inn, because that's their
Yes,
kind of. I
and
suppose
maybe she was
these.
reading tea. Yeah.
I suppose, yeah, you worry about going into a Premier Inn now. You're either going to see Lenny Henry or Darling Nikki in the corner of the lobby. But
I mean, this is the thing. Apparently, he recorded like 100 songs and gave them to the director to listen to, and the director sort of helped him pick out the right amount of songs to go on the soundtrack that would sort of fit the narrative. And I would have really liked to have been there when the director got to Darling Nikki. And he listened to it and he's like, yeah, we'll put this one on. This feels relevant. But I mean, obviously, he's a great cut. I'm not saying that he made the wrong cut. He made the right. I mean, it's sort of an incredible moment in the film, an amazing performance, and an amazing record. But yeah, there's something kind of quite funny about the director sort of structuring these songs around his narrative, and that being one of
yeah, it's like, how can we make it? This sounds Spinal Tap as well. It's like, try and make it more sexy.
them. Yeah.
Uh, and I mean, there's a scene. Morris is trying again. He's trying to woo Apollonia. Offers her a tape and says to her those kind of lines that I guess if you're an actor or actress in an 80s film, is don't you want to be a star? Trying to woo her, and it obviously works, because then they go. Is she there? He's in his little sex hut, and he hears his parents fighting again, and the dad says to his mum, "I'd die for you," which obviously we then hear as a song title later down the line.
Yeah.
She then turns up at his hut. Oh yeah, so she's bought him the guitar that it was very like Wayne's World again, wasn't it? He'd lusted after this guitar in a shop window, and she turned up at his hut with this guitar. And I didn't count, but I reckon it was probably less than a minute before he slapped her.
Yes, that comes. His jealous reaction is pretty sudden after she gives him the guitar, isn't it?
Yeah, that was kind of, I guess, with that, does she get a signing on bonus for signing up to Apollonia 6 with Morris? But yeah, she goes and buys him the guitar and then tells him that she's going to be singing and dancing and gyrating at the Taste Club, which sounds awesome. But
It's
yeah,
so
and then
funny, 'cause at no point you would have just thought that Prince might say, "Okay, if that's what you're doing to, if that's the route that you're going, maybe don't do that route. I'll have a word with the club manager, and maybe we'll be able to, get you a gig trying out some of your stuff where you don't have to sing Sex Shooter." But that doesn't seem to occur to him.
no, and I guess this is part of his whole thing, isn't it? It's even though he's got himself a stunning girlfriend who's talented, he's still only really thinking about himself.
Yeah.
And again, that there's no, I mean, I hadn't even noticed that. He doesn't make any effort to try and assist her in any way. And again, even at the end, you mentioned that he doesn't get her on stage with him because it's his moment.
Yeah.
She's very much the kind of supporting star. Um, and then we have the next day, he turns up late at the club. He's called to see the boss, and essentially being given pretty much his last rites. Again, and he's told quite outright, you're playing for yourself, you're not playing for the crowd or your band or anything else. And it's very much that kind of, I suppose we can call it rock bottom, because it leads to that most wonderful 80s trope of the glorious montage.
Oh, it's a really good montage, isn't it?
When doves cry to a montage. Is that
Yeah.
pretty much heaven for you?
It's up there. And the thing that's really amazing about it is that the song was written for the montage. So the director said, "I've got this montage. I need to have another song from you that sort of covers these kind of themes, because I need to put this put you know put this montage together, and that's what he came up with. I think kind of over the course of a couple of days. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's what happened. And
I struggle to iron a shirt over a couple of days, and he does. Yeah.
no, complete. It's sickening, these things. It's how
Um,
productive some people can be during the course of a weekend. Just
I
makes
know it's terrible.
yeah.
Imagine what he'd do in lockdown. I don't know.
Oh,
Um,
oh don't. Oh.
I mean, we both again, we talked about it. It's the way it sits alongside many other films of its time, and in this, I mean, again, a montage. You're either going to compare it to, I suppose, Rocky Four or Top Gun, both brilliant films with brilliant montages. This probably, again, it's Top Gun. He's on a motorbike. He's going to When Doves Cry, um, and the scene where, like you said, he flashbacks to the barn where he's
Yeah.
getting off with someone. I assume Apollonia, but um, I mean, it's just peak. I don't know how it's escaped me, and I talk about this a lot because there are so many films that I've done episodes on that I haven't seen. There's Labyrinth, Blade Runner, that sort of stuff, and you kind of feel like, how or why did I not watch it before at the time? And I kind of think maybe again, if I'd watched this when I was 7 or 8, it might have been wasted on me. But watching it now, I think I do have this appreciation for montages. You know, not quite. I'm not quite saying it's my specialist subject on Mastermind, but being a Prince fan and having that, I don't want to sort of point you out as that's a redeeming feature, and that's the only reason why I'm talking to you about it. But it's very much trying to get in your head about being a Prince fan and having this kind of stuff committed to celluloid. Must be great.
Yeah, it is great, and I'm really, as this film, as we're discussing, it isn't perfect, but I think it's up there as one of the great kind of films that showcase a great musical star, because Elvis made a whole load, and most of them weren't very good, and it's actually extremely difficult to make a movie that successfully captures, like, a real one-off artist, and sort of, can showcase their magnetism and talent, and the thing that made them special at that moment in time. And I'm really thankful that this film was made, because the more time goes by, the more you sort of appreciate that there are aspects of it, and the fact that it does have an overlap with Prince's own sort of personal story makes it all the better. It has him at his kind of musical peak, and it has him with the band that he worked so hard with, and they get to play quite a big part of the film as well. I mean, I find their interactions on stage, his and Wendy's in particular, actually really kind of moving to see, and it's just a really special moment in time, because we don't know what will happen in the future, but there's a good argument to be made that he is the ultimate pop star. Well, there won't be one quite like him again, quite possibly. So,
Mm.
as you say, to have things like When Doves Cry, quite possibly greatest his greatest song, sort of captured in a brilliant montage like that, it's such a great thing to have happened.
Trying to compare it to, I mean, I'm not going to even make any pretense about being up with modern or down with modern music and trying to find any kind of comparison now, because I mean things are so different now. The world has changed so much, and it's hard to find a comparison, and yet when you look back, there is everything so heavily tinged with nostalgia. And when you look at that period, that mid 80s, I mean this was 84, you've got, within a couple of years, you got Madonna makes it huge, Michael Jackson still massive, and these artists, you've got bands as well doing similar stuff, and this is just in the kind of pop environment, where when you look at it now, maybe it is just because I'm 40 and old and grumpy, and weren't things better back in my day, shouting at clouds, but it is a little bit hard to kind of imagine anything like that happening again, even with the world changing the way it is. But
Yeah, there are different things that, because on the one hand, as you say, there are aspects of this. If it was done again now, it would probably be more in terms of preserving Prince's image. It would be more sanitized, and I think there's sort of an argument for that and an argument against that. But there are other things about it, like the styling. Even he had a really great costume designer for this film called Marie France, and she sort of encouraged him to kind of really go with that sort of 17th century kind of inspired sort of like shirt, and kind of make sure that it was all kind of made out of really good fabric and things. And I think we take the imagery of something like Purple Rain for granted now because we've seen it so many times, and we kind of forget that some of those decisions are like really vital in terms of how something is preserved, in terms timeless it feels as an image. Because like if everything feels too 80s, too dated, someone kind of rocks up wearing kind of like a shiny suit, it can be great, but it can be very much rooted in its time. But there's something about the way sort of Prince is styled in this that's sort of like, it's stranger than that. It doesn't have that feeling of like you're definitely at that sort of moment in time. It's like Marilyn Monroe, isn't it, with her white dress or something. It's got that feeling that it's going to be there forever, or like Elvis doing Jailhouse Rock or something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like James Dean in his red jacket and
Yeah,
things like that.
completely. It's got
Yeah,
that.
this is the thing, the film is 37 years old, and yet watching it for the first time and seeing all this stuff, it's incredibly 80s, and yet there's parts of it that aren't 80s at all, and it is fascinating to see. And I guess it has opened my eyes and my ears a bit more to Prince in a way that I suppose obviously that was probably part of the intention. I suppose if you make a film about an artist, and again now we're in an age where biopics of old and deceased artists are now becoming popular again with Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Man and things like that, where it's not. I mean, it's very much not the same, but there's still, and there's the elements of control there that perhaps Prince allowed the reins to come off a little bit. Whereas it feels like, I mean, Elton John was so involved in his own biopic.
It's not that I think that there shouldn't be any involvement, because obviously this film is something that's sort of produced by Prince's management. So like, and it is a vehicle for Prince. But and like another thing that's an example is Madonna's In Bed with Madonna that came out in 1990 as a sort of fly on the wall documentary of Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour, which again, would be used as a promotional vehicle. But I think Madonna did give free rein to the person filming, sort of saying you can film as much as you like and you can use what you like. Like that's the thing. There has to be some kind of cutoff point where the person making the film is allowed to be an artist themselves. And like I think with something like this film, the director really pushed Prince's for there to be that scene where Prince's father hits him, and Prince said to him like, "What? Why does this matter so much to you? Why do you think that should happen?" And he said, "Well, people want to see, you're this rock star, and if you get hit, that's people will, if you're gonna go and do that to someone else in the film, people will want to see that happen to you as well." And you think that's a good directorial decision, I think, and that person should be allowed to have that kind of influence. It shouldn't just be this sort of little trailer that's made by a pop star.
No, but I agree. I mean, that was the whole essence. That again, how much of it's true or not, when Sacha Baron Cohen was supposedly lined up to play Freddie Mercury in the film, and then he stepped away because the rest of the band they didn't like the way the film was going. They wanted it to go in a certain way, and it ended up being Bohemian Rhapsody, which was entertaining in its own way. It's all right.
I
Um,
haven't seen it. Yeah.
but but you wonder where it would have gone. It was I don't know. I think obviously it took into account a lot of Freddie Mercury's issues and his lifestyle and everything. But you do wonder where it might have gone in different hands, and had it not been quite so heavily controlled by the three surviving members of Queen. But that's a question for those who've made millions off "We Will Rock You" and so on. But that's a
Yeah.
conversation if if we ever sit down again and talk about anything to do with Queen. But I mean, coming back to this, it's we've got the scene. I mean, there's the where he does Computer Blue on the stage, and like you said, that the interaction between him and Wendy. I mean, she's on her knees in front of him, you know, certain angles. Anyway, that looks quite suggestive, deliberately so, I guess. But
Well, it's a bit. It reminded me. Wasn't there some kind of famous performance of David Bowie and Mick Ronson where they did that? I thought that it might be trying
oh,
to
okay,
recreate that. I think so. And also, there's like I know that Prince saw the very famous film documentary Woodstock with his
mm,
dad when he was young, and I think that had a big effect on him. And a lot of those scenes in the film do feel very inspired by Jimi Hendrix,
yeah,
who he didn't do that thing that you're describing there, but obviously sort of Jimi Hendrix would sort of set fire to his guitars and sort of bash them about and generally kind of do things that were quite provocative with them. So
yeah. I mean, that's followed by him doing "Darling Nikki" or playing the song "Darling Nikki," um, and she storms out. And after the next hit is the, the sex shooter. It does sound like a Spinal Tap. The more you say Spinal Tap, the more it's kind of drilled in. Um, and this is a film where you expect there to be a song called "Lick My Love Pump."
yeah,
Um,
completely. That is
you know,
the kind of thing Prince would do. Yeah.
"Ah." um, and afterwards, I mean, they have there's this weird sequence where her and Morris, she's, let's say, drunk on success and whatever's in his hip flask, in the alleyway behind her. There's the steam coming out like something out of, again, I've always got to mention Street Hawk in here somewhere, where a motorbike comes out the shadows and hits Morris, and it's Prince on his motorbike chasing her down the street. And
Morris is so
uh,
funny in that scene.
oh, he's just brilliant, isn't he?
He's so great.
But then he utters, I suppose, the one thing that wouldn't pass now as a somewhat homophobic slur at Prince as he makes
Yeah.
off into the night with Apollonia on the back of the motorbike, and then they have another fight. And this is, I suppose, she throws the earring at him. It's kind of very symbolic.
Yes. Yes. There's that scene, isn't there, where one thing that I like, and she's wearing that cloak. I think they did film this film either I think in the autumn and the winter when it was really cold, and I do feel so sorry for Apollonia because so many of the scenes she's sort of required to wear underwear and a cloak, and those are her clothes. She doesn't seem, you know, they don't kind of let her kind of at any point put on a cardigan, and my heart goes out to her. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to have a nice, sensible cardigan. I mean, if she's going to wear that sort of stuff on stage, she wants to come off, she wants to get comfortable, not wearing a cloak and being dragged around on a motorbike. And
No, well, that's the thing. I know that it
mm,
was important to the director. That was why he kept all the gritty content in this film. I think the Warner Brothers, I think, were quite shocked when they saw the first cut of or at least when they saw the script, and they wanted him to kind of take out a lot of the gritty content, and he pushed to leave it in because he wanted it to be authentic about a certain scene and certain moment in time. But that's the thing about Apollonia. I kind of think I wonder how authentic that is. Would someone like Apollonia be wearing a cardigan at that moment? I think maybe she would have, or maybe a jumper. I think that would have been authentic.
yeah, and have a nice cup of tea when you come off stage.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing I was slightly surprised about after this, the kid's gone home, and there's the house is smashed up. We've already had the scene where he's discovered his dad's basement studio. As you mentioned, his dad was a musician, um, and this time his dad's got a gun and he shoots himself in the head. And there's this kind of scene which, again, this is the bit where watching it you can tell that Prince isn't an actor.
Yeah.
because when the police have left, and there is these kind of scenes where, in the films where they have all the tape around the gun and stuff, and he starts smashing everything up, and it is, I know it's a very poignant moment. His dad's almost killed himself, and his life's in turmoil, and but the way he smashes everything up, it's almost like he looks almost like he's enjoying it in a way. And I know,
I think
you're
this
doing
is
it as
where
a
you
cathartic way.
this is where your tidiness instinct kicks in, isn't it?
Well, I mean, why would you make a mess like that? I mean, you're only going to have to tidy it up afterwards anyway.
These aren't that bad.
Well, if everyone was like me, there'd be no problems in the world. It's funny because that is like a thing where you get, it's almost what comes either before or after the montage, the smashing everything up really dramatically, and this is where he finds sheets and sheets and sheets of his dad's music that he's written, and it's very that kind of settles him down.
Yeah, I mean the whole the film is so interesting because it's like there are three different films happening simultaneously, and moments like that. It is when he goes back to his home and his father trying to kill himself and finding the music. It sort of becomes quite sort of like a Tennessee Williams play or something, and then you go back to a scene with Morris Day, and you're kind of back in a sort of Marx Brothers world or something, and then back into this incredible musical film. And I don't know, like I mean I quite like it for those different shades, I suppose, because it means that you can't really class the whole thing, can you, as just an escapist bit of 80s trash in the way that you can with some things, because it's certainly sort of like showing you quite a lot of darkness, isn't it? And in comparison to obviously the sort of blinding light that he gets at the end of the film when he sings his songs.
I
Wow.
mean, we've already had so the Time have done their performance of The Bird, which was quite a catchy little number and some nice dance moves and everything, and
Yeah.
the Revolution, they're in the changing room, and Prince has got his new guitar that Apollonia bought for him, and the crowd are waiting, and we've heard this motif throughout this film. I don't think we touched upon it really, where it was the song that the girls in the band had written,
Yeah.
and he'd very much dismissed. And every time you play the opening couple of seconds of it, it's clearly Purple Rain when
Yeah.
37 years later. And again, it's part of his, he's playing his dad's music at the piano. He's now, thinking of other people because he's listening to the music that his colleagues or his bandmates have written, and he's now turning that into the thing that's going to turn him into Mega Prince.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing in the end, isn't it? It's kind of, it feels more, in some ways, more like a love story about him and his band than it does between him and Apollonia in some respects. That because there is something genuinely moving about him performing that song and saying it's the song the girls in the band wrote, and then at one point during Purple Rain he goes over and he kisses Wendy on the cheek and she looks really moved, and the whole thing comes across as really authentic. And you've seen that there's a really great scene, I think, earlier on in the film where she sort of confronts him in the rehearsal room, and you kind of get the sense of there being that tension in the band, and there's something about it all kind of coming together then at the end that's really great. It's funny as well, like I noticed when I was watching one of the live scenes this time that Prince is wearing heels and Wendy is wearing sneakers.
Hmm.
And it's not often that you see that. Like, in as much as, you have this other scenes in this film that we've been sort of like laughing at, like, the Apollonia 6 scenes and stuff. But there is something about the Revolution as a band when you see them sort of playing together, where actually, there isn't gender stereotyping going on. Everyone is sort of like just doing their own thing. And it actually feels, even right now at this moment in time, 2021, it feels really sort of like refreshing, and like everyone is just able to be like an individual that they want to be, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of I'm not an expert at this, but people they're not pigeonholed, and I think that, like you said, people are just themselves. That because there's no need to kind of put people on environments that they're not in. You don't need to dress this stuff up. I mean, if that's Prince, you're not going to turn him into someone who wears a suit and tie or jeans and a baggy hoodie or something like that. If it's Prince, it's going to be Prince. If it's going to be the people in his band, then that's fine. And
Mm.
now more than ever, that's probably more acceptable and it would have been quite surprising to a lot of people back then because to a lot of people, they weren't used to that stuff, and attitudes were changing. I mean, you can look at Top of the Pops from the era, and people were starting to dress more flamboyantly and wearing makeup and
Why?
stuff
I
that.
think he was quite in his image. I think he had been watching a lot of,
Mm,
Adamant videos and
oh dear.
stuff, so you can sort of see that kind of bleeding into how he looks
Mm,
here and stuff. But the odd thing is, I would have been hearing this music and stuff in the 90s, and there was something about getting into Prince like during the height of Britpop that was quite interesting. Like I had, just the absolutely gigantic Prince poster above my bed when Oasis would have been at the height of their fame. And I think that that probably isn't a coincidence. I think there was probably something about Prince and the way there's something about his ethos where you sort of feel like you can be yourself if you don't necessarily feel like you want to completely sort of fit in with the kind of the norm of the time. Then I mean, I think Pulp did that really well. You were talking about Pulp earlier. I think I really like Pulp too. There was something about that kind of like lad culture during the 90s that could sometimes, if you didn't feel like completely comfortable with it, it could make you feel like a bit of an outsider. And there's something about someone like Prince that makes you feel okay with being kind of on the outside of that, if that makes sense.
I mean, that's kind of almost encouraged, I think, now with it. There isn't these days. Oh, I sound old, don't I? Where there is less of a kind of dominant type of music. Um, Back in the mid 90s, that couple of years, sort of 94, 95, 96, where it was Oasis or Blur, Oasis or Blur. It's like one or the other. There's this binary thing. And the minute you say something different, like, I don't know, Pulp,
Yeah.
to just pluck one out of the air, people go, oh, right, yeah, I like them, but which, are you Blur Oasis? And it's kind of a bit strange to, a lot of people were pigeonholed, and of course, there were other types of music then, but living in this country in that period of time, that was so dominant in a way that certainly probably hasn't been like that since. Maybe a couple of that was kind of as Take That and Spice Girls were on the cusp of their own sort of eras as well, and you think if you're getting into or if you're looking for something alternative, then even at that point, Prince would be an attractive thing for a lot of people to look at because it was different. I mean, it was different in the 80s, it was different in the 90s, and even now you think there is an air of familiarity to a lot of it, but having that alternative, and I mean, again, I'll completely show myself which camp I was in. I mean, I went to see Oasis at Nebworth
Oh, did
that
you?
year. Yeah,
What was
and
that like?
I got really badly sunburnt. If that, it was
What a good
uh,
review.
well, I mean, they were good. The support acts were really, really, really good, and it was hard because you don't really understand the concept of how many people were there until you see it in pictures or in the news further down the line. But yeah, I do wonder if my musical tastes were quite blinkered at the time, I guess, and having the option or having Prince there or having any other alternative at the time would have made things certainly different at the time,
Well,
maybe.
Prince was quite an unfashionable person to be a fan of at that time because he was going through all this difficulty with his record company.
Yeah,
So he'd, make public appearances on, he'd be on TV and he wouldn't speak or he'd have something sort of over his face, so he came across as extremely kind of eccentric, and yeah, so it was a slightly odd. Yeah, you had to kind of fight quite hard to make your case for him at the time. I think. Well, it would obviously it would have depended on who you were hanging around with. I mean, I was like my friend, one of my oldest friends, Rhiannon, was always into Prince as well, so I had her to talk to about him. But apart from that, and it was interesting. The other day, I saw the music journalist. I don't know whether you saw this on Twitter. The music journalist Simon Price wrote a tweet about Oasis not
Oh
having
yeah.
not having
Mm.
fast like that sort of making the case that the reason why Oasis weren't as good as people sort of seem to think they are was that they didn't have any fast songs, that you couldn't. They were this rock band that didn't have any songs that you could really dance to. And I was thinking that's the thing, oddly, about kind of the way people categorize music, because when I was listening to Let's Go Crazy at the beginning of Purple Rain, I was thinking Let's Go Crazy is a really fantastic rock song that you can dance to. It's a really brilliant opener to the film. I know that he played it at a lot of his gigs. I think it was sort of like a favorite throughout his life. It's quite an interesting. I know that it caused a lot of controversy on Twitter because people were sort of debating that for all weekend, I think. But yeah, I was thinking it's funny how, because Prince sort of like merged all of these different genres of music, they don't kind of put him in one category or another, quite rightly. But something like Let's Go Crazy is a very good example of a rock song that you can dance to.
Yeah, or even the opening of When Doves Cry, that kind of starts one way and then goes into what it is. There are a lot of heavy leanings, in all different kind of genres, and
Yes, yeah, completely.
yeah,
Well,
and
it
and
starts with that amazing bit of guitar, doesn't it? Yeah.
oh yeah, and then when you have this, I mean, the film is essentially a huge long build up because it's like when you get to just play that song, um, you know what's coming. And in any film where music is heavily themed, there is the kind of you're waiting for that one big performance. And when he comes on stage and does Purple Rain, everyone thinks his dad's dead. Just a spoiler alert, he's not. Um,
Yeah.
but he comes on stage and he's visibly emotional. He's clearly restrained in a way. Obviously, he's kind of channeling it differently. And all the things that we've kind of heard people say to him about, it's not about you. You've got to play to the crowd and be more in the moment. And conveying that all in Purple Rain, which then goes, it almost becomes a medley with I Would Die for You and Baby I'm a Star afterwards.
Yeah.
There's an encore halfway through, but I mean that having that as the kind of key pivotal moment of the finale in one of the most famous songs, just to kind of, obviously at the time it was new to a lot of, well, pretty much everyone, but coming back even now and watching that, I mean, it's enormous. I mean, it's one of these descriptions you need a thesaurus to describe really how big a kind of ending it is.
I know. The really weird thing is, I found out that it was just one of these songs that he played um, at a gig in Minnesota, and he was just sort of like trying out different new songs. And I think the director came up to him sort of afterwards and said, "That song that you sang, that one, it sounded a bit like Bob Dylan, that one." And Prince said, "What, Purple Rain?" He said, "Yeah, yeah. I think that you should use that in the film. That should probably be how we kind of, sort of like bring the film to a climax." And he was like, "Oh right, okay. Oh, can we call the film Purple Rain then?" The director went, "Yeah, okay." And you kind of think that's just, if that's true, that's mad, because it all feels much more calculated than that, doesn't it? Like they've been working on that song for
Hmm.
ages, and that they kind of knew that that's the way they were going to do the whole thing. But I think it's all much more sort of serendipitous than that. Amazing.
It's funny when you do read into the backgrounds of films and stuff, and how many, well, I guess things evolve and become almost like fables or urban myths as things get older. But you always kind of hear stories about how a lot of film titles or song choices become iconic almost by accident.
Yes.
And I guess this is a very good example.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine if you're recording so many things. Like if you've got like 100 songs that you're suggesting for a soundtrack, it must be really difficult to sort of stand apart from it, and look at it objectively, mustn't it?
Yeah. And what happened to the other 85? Where did they go? Did they get
Oh,
dropped into other stuff? Is there a lost Purple Rain somewhere?
there probably is. I think there's just a ridiculous vault filled with Prince songs. I think they're releasing more and more of them now. But you know that bit at the beginning where he's got his glasses on, he sort of stands behind Apollonia.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is funny. That actually I thought, you know what, the end of Pretty in Pink, when um
Hmm.
Andy's at the prom and she turns around and she sees Ducky at the end of the corridor. I think Ducky was channeling a bit of Prince and Purple Rain there,
Yeah.
with his
He
glasses
flicked.
and his quiff, and
Hmm.
you know.
That's a good link. I think the way that Ducky, and I mean Ducky's expression at the end when that, after Andy and Blaine have gone off into the car park doing whatever, and he's chosen by the other guy, and he breaks that fourth wall, looking to the camera. There is that kind of thing to it where, again, that's another film that, having rewatched recently, and the soundtrack has made its way into my kind of regularly listened on Spotify, and ends on a huge song that was written almost at the last minute, or in
Yes,
that
of
case
course.
by OMD.
Yeah, of course.
Um, and that there is links, and let's be really basic and say they've both got colours in the title, but
Yeah.
it's just so amazing to think that the film throughout has, I mean, it's emotional, it's funny, it's silly, it's really quite dark in parts, and then ends on this huge crowd pleasing epic number, which then becomes that kind of thing, like, imagine being there when this was being made, or when this was being filmed. And I guess a lot of people seeing that, and again, you hope, I mean, the magic of cinema and stuff, and how many takes were there of this, but being in that crowd, or being there when he was doing this, and channeling all that, must have been a amazing experience for those people, albeit.
Yeah, I think that was the first time the crowd had heard Purple Rain as well. So the reactions that you're seeing, and I think that's filmed really, really beautifully in terms of the crowd as well, isn't it? Because you get a lot of sort of shots of them just kind of standing there, sort of taking it in. It's not just Prince and the revolution that you see, and you can kind of
Yeah.
tell that. And the soundtrack's quite unusual in that way, because a lot of the tracks are sort of their live recorded versions that then they would have done a certain amount of overdubbing and stuff, but it really does sort of capture that live experience as a soundtrack album as well, which is quite interesting. But the Pretty in Pink soundtrack, if you've been listening to that a lot, there's a song by Jesse Johnson on it called "Get to Know You," which um, is relevant to this film because he used to be in the Time.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So, and I've always thought, in fact, I think the first time I heard that song, I think I did actually think it was Prince. The first time I heard it. It sounds very Prince. If you listen to it again, you'll know what I mean.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay. Small world. And during, we have a small montage, because it's not an 80s movie without a final montage. During I Would Die for You, we see that his dad has survived his gunshot to the head. Um, he's in hospital. I guess that's kind of an odd one. This is a guy who's clearly got some demons, but I guess you don't want to darken it too much. He survived anyway.
There is something about the film where they kind of show how the perspective is quite male, isn't it?
Hmm.
You kind of see the father's pain, you see Prince's pain, and then you see what Apollonia goes through, and you see what his mother's going through, but you're kind of left with more of an understanding, I think, of what Prince and his father are feeling about it all.
Yeah, because we see his mother kind of at the bedside of her dad in hospital, and Apollonia, like you mentioned, she's in the crowd when he does Purple Rain, and everyone's crying, and everyone's, and she's there, she gives him a kiss, but he leaves her there. There could have been that moment where he brought her out onto stage, but then during the montage, she arrives at his basement, and
Yeah.
there's the reuniting of the earring.
Yes, and you know that at that point they're living a comfortable domestic life together because she's allowed to put on a vest.
He's really melted, hasn't he?
He really has. Yeah. She's been allowed to finally take off her basque. And,
That must have been a massive relief.
it must have been a massive relief. Yeah, completely. That's actually the version of a fluffy onesie is wearing sort of like tight black vest. Yeah, so
People find comfort in all sorts of things. I don't know.
completely. I think she's really good though. I think there's something about like she most of her role in the film is to kind of react to Prince. That's the main
Mm.
thing she's there for, and it's actually quite a lot of pressure on a person to kind of sit there in a scene like when he's singing the beautiful ones, and she has to just react to it. And I think she does a really good job. You know, she's got a lot of she conveys the a sort of a softness in the film that it kind of needs, doesn't it? So,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think she grounds him a little bit, and as you say, she's there as his foil almost, but she does push back, and I guess we joked before about the comparison with her and Cassandra from Wayne's World. She's this. I mean, she has much less of a role. I mean, Cassandra was a lot more dominant in that film, but you do wonder if that was a kind of something that they may have taken some inspiration from.
I think they
Um,
must have done because there's quite a lot of parallels, isn't there? Like Wayne is in his parents' basement, and then you have Cassandra, and she wants to get the record deal, and then they have the thing at the end of the film where Wayne sort of drops his stuff and makes kind of her getting noticed his
mm,
objective. And yeah, I'm sure they probably did take a little bit of a. I mean, you can see why this plays out in a different way, because if at the end of Wayne's World your option was, shall we get Tia Carrere to rock out at the end, or should we get Mike Myers to rock out? You probably go with Tia. Whereas here they've got Prince, and you're like, okay, I can kind of see why you might give centre stage to Prince at the end of this film, because it is Prince.
yeah,
So I suppose these things are going to be affected by who you've got to work with.
I mean that film wasn't called Purple Wayne. I mean, I don't know. And we do get the ultimate ending. It ends on a freeze frame of pure Prince blue steel, purple steel, I suppose. I mean that was a proper stare, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's so good. I like that. It's very it's 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 so it's so 80s, isn't it? That last little shot.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful man.
I mean,
Oh,
things like that little flourish at the end do work very well if you see it in a cinema. You kind of
oh,
need to have those nice little sort of tongue-in-cheek shots, where someone's really sort of playing up to the idea of how much of a star they are. And actually, his last performance, when he sings "Baby I'm a Star" at the end of the film, he looks so relaxed and like having so much fun.
well, that was Purple Rain. We did it. We made it. It's been discussed and planned and parodied for many a month. Thank you so much. We'll have to rewind this Betamax. I'm getting quite emotional now.
Oh, thank you so much.
No, well, you brought the video and the soundtrack, and yeah, and I know you said, when I mentioned about it's a shame about Darling Nikki that she couldn't join us, but yeah, she was unavailable. I think she probably got arrested. Um, or the hotel police. Now, obviously, this is your. I suppose I should really keep a score of this. I guess it's probably your sixth
Yeah, I
podcast.
think it
of
might
this.
be. Yeah.
Yeah, well done.
What a patient man you are. I mean, I think that's testament to your resilience.
Well, maybe I just learned the lessons at Princeton and give the people what they want. Um, Clearly, if I mean, we've talked about some of your other appearances in podcasts when you've been on previously. Now, I suppose it's a good time to mention that you're also due to appear on a podcast that's coming soon after this is released anyway, and you're talking about a film that you actually mentioned earlier in this episode as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what, your talk on the Coppola connections?
Yes, I'm going to be talking about Saturday Night Fever with Petros on the Coppola Connections podcast, and that's at Caged In Pod on Twitter. And yeah, there's so many things about that film that inspired this film, I think. In fact, I heard that when the director of Purple Rain showed the script to Warner Brothers, they suggested that maybe John Travolta could play Prince.
He's a chameleon.
And he said, I don't think that'll work, you know. But that sort of shows, I think, that it was kind of clear from the script that it had been quite influenced by Saturday Night Fever in a really great way. So yeah, I'd really like it if people listen to that. And I also hear that you are on the same podcast talking about The Conversation.
Yeah, so I guess I think both our episodes will be out in April. I think was it when the podcast goes out. But yeah, it's and this is the thing what Petros is doing. I mean, Petros. Some people might remember he was my guest when we talked about Lethal Weapon long time ago, 2017, I think that was. And he's putting this podcast together of basically any film involving anyone who's got Coppola DNA or a link to marriage or cleaned their house or washed their car or something like that. And so mine is The Conversation, which was a Coppola directed film, which was one of my favourites.
Yeah, fantastic film.
Nice little surveillance drama there. But yeah, it's amazing how he's gone from, well, in our case, from The Conversation to Saturday Night Fever, and I think from some of the others. I mean, there's going to be all sorts of Rocky and Grand Budapest Hotel and all sorts. So yeah, when that launches, that'll be launching on April the 7th on Petros's link. So we'll put some links there as well because we like to show off here, don't we?
Oh, it's gonna be great. Yeah, which has really made me think that I need to do my Cage homework actually a little bit more to go into that well.
Or is that just an excuse to watch Moonstruck again?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Snap out of it. Come on. Well, as usual on the podcast, we normally play out with the film that was number one in the UK when the film was released. Now, Purple Rain was released in the UK on the 27th of July, 1984. Now, the number one song when that came out was Two Tribes by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Now, honestly, I'm having maybe some temporary amnesia, but that was also the number one song when Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom came out the month beforehand.
What a great
And
year for film.
oh, fantastic, wasn't it? And it was also number one when Splash was released in June 1984. So I'm going to take advantage of having a film involving one of the greatest pop stars of all time. And I mean, he played out his film of sorts with Purple Rain. So I think, should we have Purple Rain ending the podcast?
Oh, yes, please.
Yes. And I think I'm well past the lawyers getting involved now, so I might be really self-indulgent and play the whole bloody thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Epic.
I'll stick you up Spotify. Yeah. Katrin, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Rich.
I never meant to call you in your sorrow. I never meant to call you in your pain. I'm the one who wants to have you laughing. I only want to see All I want to be some kind of friend. Hey. Baby, I can never steal you from another. It's such a shame our friendship had to end. Purple rain, purple rain. Purple rain, purple rain. Purple rain, purple rain. Only want to see you underneath the purple. Honey, I know, times are changing. It's time we all reach out for something new. That means you too. You say you want a leader, but you can't seem to make up your mind. I think you better close it and let me guide you to the purple rain. Purple rain, purple rain. Purple rain, purple rain. You know what I'm saying about up here? Come on, raise your hand. Purple rain, purple rain.
This podcast was brought to you by executive producers Keith Foster, Jimmy Fletcher, Mark Drakes, Matt Cunnington, Chris Hopkins, Omar Zambon, Ian Madrell, Catherine Lowe, Mark Makin, Zoltan Vargo, Simon Smith, Wayne McNally, Darren Hodgkins, Dan Wellington, Alex Heal, Philip Rothenberger, Alan Fewings, Tom Carr, James Kennedy, Simon Pegg, Joe Harrison, Anita Singh, Doug Grant, Andrew Elliott, Bobby Richmond, associate producer Chris Oakley. Visit patreon.com/Betamax Video Club for more information around bonus episodes, early access, discounted merchandise and more.